Thank you, Colin. Hi, everyone online. Thank you for flying up, Thea. I guess you would have been on a plane joining us a year ago, but it's wonderful to have you here in Rochester today. My name is Amaret Miller. Thank you, Colin, for that introduction. I wear a couple of different hats here in our community. Today, I'm going to focus on my Afscme Council 66 hat. COVID has affected work, how we work, and how we manage at work. Many of us are working from home right now, some are not. Before I get into that, the unemployment rate in our area here in Greater Rochester was at a low 3.5% in November. Most of the population was working. Employers were having a hard time finding talent. Enter COVID in March, most workers were sent home, and many were starting to get furloughed. That means, no more stops at the coffee shop like we used to, or after work at the bar. We haven't been buying that many clothes or shoes. Our gas consumption is down. So tax revenue in New York State started to wane. Of course, across the country, it's the same trend. Now I'll focus on Afscme Council 66 a bit. Afscme Council 66 represents 87 Afscme unions across the 27 county area here in upstate New York. So we represent members of the public sector. Think about municipalities, the towns, the schools, some colleges, police, and private hospitals. So our workers are directly affected by budget shortfalls and of course by COVID, because a lot of our workers work in the respiratory field. And so, of course, we know the federal government, they stepped in with the supplemental $600 a week, and that was a relief to millions of workers all over the state. And locals like Afscme 1635, that's our union of the city of Rochester, they were able to take part in the work share agreement. New York State Department of Labor allowed them to work half of the time and be furloughed and receive the enhanced unemployment the rest of the time. So that was a pretty interesting deal, because recreation centers really didn't have much going on, but they were handing out food to, the public, and they had work to do. So, that ended around August or so, and our members there, they went back to work. So for us, that was a good example of a municipality taking part in the Department of Labor's program to alleviate some of the budget and keep workers working. I'm gonna jump to Syracuse. We have unions in Syracuse, the city of Syracuse. They were facing $1 million budget shortfall. And at first they proposed layoffs, and no one likes that, of course. And so all of our unions sat down and we got together. They got together at the table and started thinking, and they thought about a furlough plan. They spoke to different workers, more senior workers and everything, to see how it would go over with the membership. And members really liked the idea. So the plan ended up being 4 days of furlough, maybe one this week and one in 3 months, and one in June and one in August, for example. So that day you wouldn't get paid for. But not only that, the mayor took part, and all of the city workers took part, union or not. So this happened, and it was an amazing furlough plan. And it got great attention. But the cool thing about it, though, is that it saved money. No one lost their job, and it just showed that we're all in this together. Then I'm gonna turn to Bente. Excuse me, our Rochester City School District Union. So Bente 2419, is a union of about 1,100 members. They service the city school district here in Rochester. You'll find us in security. We do food service. We clean and sanitize the buildings. We're the school secretaries. We are the support staff of the school for the students. But think about it. If there are no students, what do we do? So we were handing out food this summer, and I say we for all of our members because this is what we are, where are we? We, our food service workers, were handing out food this summer because a lot of our schools were centers where you can go pick up breakfast and lunch. So we had work to do. And our food service workers were on the front lines. We didn't know much about COVID. So, we were just wearing masks and gloves and hoping we wouldn't catch it. But in the beginning of the year, what's unique about the Rochester City School District is that we went full remote, whereas the outskirts and the towns went hybrid. And the same is for Buffalo, and I don't know if it is the same for Syracuse and Albany, but I know for sure Rochester and Buffalo are full remote right now. Already facing a budget shortfall, the city of the Rochester City School District, we understood that there was a budget shortfall in the state. And because public schools are funded largely by the state, funded by the state for the most part, we were seeing and facing a 20% cut. Now, the reason for the remote was for the safety of the students and the teachers, of course, and we were all home. Now, but that also caused our workers to not have jobs to go to. We didn't have food to cook. We didn't have students to secure. If you don't have students in the buildings, how are you going to utilize us? So the union faced the layoff situation, and about 200 of our security and food service were laid off at the end of October. Hopefully they'll be coming back, but right now, a lot of them were making so little in wage to begin with that they might not even be making $100 a week in unemployment. There's no unemployment enhancement for them. And they don't have health care right now because they're not working. It's not a furlough situation, it's a layoff. So we're hoping for the Rochester City School District to slowly open up. And Bente's president, Dan DiClemente, is in talks right now. We're rolling it out, figuring out who's going back and when. But I just wanted to give you a little taste of, a little of the success and a little bit of what's going on, depending on what municipality and school district we're talking about. It really depends on the leadership, and it depends on, I guess, the financial situation. But I really do look forward to hearing what Thea has to say. And thank you so much. I'll send it back to you, Colin. Back to you, Colin.
Yeah, I'm just taking longer than I thought I would need to reassert myself on camera there. Thanks so much, Emma. I really appreciate you sharing some of the experiences that have gone on over the year now. And I know that the situation with Bente members has been one that we've been pushing on and fighting for a while now, and we're hoping that part of the inspiration for this talk locally was some of the struggles faced by Bente members, and so I hope that as this moves forward, we can come to some answers that might start to improve the situation for them.
Thank you.
So I want to turn now to Thea Lee to really give the sort of primary presentation for tonight. But I also want to let folks know before doing that we are, after her presentation, going to move into a sort of Q&A section. You're welcome to write questions in the Q&A field in the sort of in the Zoom client, but we're also if you'd like to note whether or not you're okay being brought onto camera to do that, I would be happy to. We like to see folks. We like to engage in sort of more face-to-face conversation. So I think it'll be a good opportunity to do that. So if you can note in your Q&A written that you're okay being called on, then I will call on you and just be ready to be put on camera. Excuse me. So let's get down to why so many folks are here, right? Thea Lee is the president of the Economic Policy Institute. She has a longstanding relationship with EPI, having began her career as an international trade economist in the 1990s. She also came to EPI from the AFL-CIO, where she served as deputy chief of staff. She spent her career advocating on behalf of working families in national policy debates on issues such as wage inequality, workers' rights, and fair trade. She's co-author of The Field Guide to the Global Economy, published by the New Press, and has authored numerous publications on the North American Free Trade Agreement, the impact of national trade on U.S. Wage inequality and the domestic steel and textile industries. And as on a personal note, my youth organizing, my first sort of activist efforts began through the sort of movement to push back on the free trade area of the Americas, and in United Students Against Sweatshops, in both of which, in both of those places, Thea's work was important and inspirational. So I'm excited to have her here joining us today, and hope that you all are as excited as me. And I'll kick it over to you, Thea.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colin. And Amarette, wonderful to hear from you. It's wonderful and also, I think, sobering to just hear what kinds of challenges workers are facing down on the ground. It's one of the reasons I am happy to join all of you tonight, brothers and sisters. As Colin said, I come out of the labor movement. I spent 20 years of my life at the AFL-CIO. And so for me, this is one of the kinds of talks I like to give to folks, and also I'm looking forward to your questions and to the conversation as we connect around what's going on. This is an extraordinary moment in history, and I work at the Economic Policy Institute. We've been around since 1986, and we are a think tank that focuses on working family issues. And that's sort of why we exist, is to bring some of these economic policy debates, to bring working people's voices into those debates. So what I hope to do tonight is just talk a little bit broad terms about what's going on in the economy, what is needed, but also try to, I think, bolster the kinds of arguments that I hope you all are making at the state and local level, because I feel like this is one of those cases where the arguments of what kind of economic policies we need are so powerful and so strong, and yet we have these folks in Congress who are dragging their feet and obstructing, and it seems to me that what we need to do is change the national debate. We need to really hold our lawmakers accountable when they fail to take actions that would save millions and millions of jobs. This is within their power, and yet they're choosing not to do it. Right now, as we speak, Mitch McConnell in the Senate is throwing up one obstacle after another to getting the final piece of stimulus relief legislation passed, and it is unconscionable. So we are at this moment with where the pandemic hit in March, and as Amarette said, immediately it was a cataclysmic kind of economic event, something none of us have seen in our lifetimes, on a par with the Great Depression, maybe even more extreme in some cases. We haven't really been keeping economic data that long, but the kinds of job losses we saw, because this was a situation where the government had to shut down the economy. We told people to stay home. We told businesses to close. And because the government took that extraordinary measure, the government also has a responsibility to take care of people. If we want people for safety's sake to stay home, not go to work, not open their businesses, then we also have to pay them. And the first CARES Act, the first round of relief, was actually a pretty good down payment. As Amaret said, there was a $600 additional UI payment. There was a $1,200 check for folks. And those were really big, bold, important measures, and they made a huge difference. So even in those first couple of months of the pandemic, when people were staying home or laid off or on short hours, poverty actually fell in the United States, and incomes were actually maintained because of the extraordinary measures that the government took. But then what happened? They ran out at the end of July, the extended unemployment insurance, and of course the one-time $1,200 checks ran out. But the crisis wasn't over. And so we've had since the end of July, and now we have another deadline coming up at the end of December, where the extended unemployment insurance is about to run out, and millions of workers are going to be left with very little resources if the Congress doesn't act. So we have this perfect storm that is happening right now: the expiration of the extended unemployment insurance, the resurgence of the virus, we saw an acceleration of layoffs this week. The numbers that came out this week saw a spike, so that we're back up to the kind of layoffs we were seeing in the month of September. And yet we have the federal government failing to give the kind of aid to state and local governments that is needed for two reasons. There's two things that are important about that. I think you all know this because you're living it, but state and local governments cannot borrow to fund their ongoing operations. They can't do deficit spending the way the federal government can. The federal government has that ability to do it, and it is absolutely the right thing to do in the middle of a crisis, is to run up the deficit, to spend that money in order to keep people from going under. So state and local governments, Amaret mentioned, and I think you all know, are losing revenues because sales tax, property tax, all the kinds of things. People aren't buying coffee, they aren't going to the bar, they aren't staying in hotels, they aren't going to work, they aren't taking public transit. Everything that state and local governments do is losing money. And yet they can't do the deficit spending. It's very hard to raise revenues. That is definitely something that state and local governments are going to need to do at some point, hopefully with progressive taxes by taxing the wealthy. But in the short run, in the middle of the pandemic, that's hard to do. So you have the loss of revenues, and that will lead to layoffs. And the layoffs have a double whammy impact on the economy also, because what happens, of course, is that people get laid off, they stop spending money. That makes the economy even worse. And at the same time, the services, and you all know what kind of services are being provided state and local government: public safety, fire and police, public health, teachers. These are garbage pickup, public transit. These are all things that the economy needs to be healthy. So when you cut off public services in the middle of a pandemic, you make everything worse. You make the health crisis worse because you don't have the public health workers, you don't have the beds in hospitals, and so on. So it's really, it's unconscionable is the word I used before. And one of the things at EPI, we pulled together a group of bipartisan economists a couple of months ago to talk about the importance of the federal government doing substantial, and by substantial, I mean around $1 trillion, somewhere between 500 billion and $1 trillion is the kind of substantial aid that the federal government must give to state and local governments. So we had a bipartisan panel of economists talking about that. And this is one of these things, I mean, you know, I'm on the left side of the economic spectrum, but we had the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors from George W. Bush, Glenn Hubbard, and the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, Jason Furman, and Mark Zandi, who's with economist.com, and Benga Ajilore from CAP, and Josh Bivens, who's the research director at EPI. So all of these economists across the political spectrum, Republican and Democrat, were in complete consensus about the importance of the federal government giving aid to state and local governments, and yet it hasn't happened. So we have consensus. We have Jerome Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, who is a Republican, who was appointed by Donald Trump to that post. He agrees that the state and local government aid needs to happen. And one of the things that we talk about in economics is the multiplier effect, that every dollar that the federal government spends on state and local aid actually generates $1.70 worth of output, because it keeps people employed, it keeps the economy going, and it keeps those public services there. So this is a really strong, powerful argument of what is needed. One of the other things that we know also for sure is that not doing the state and local, not giving the aid to state and local governments has a disproportionately bad impact on Black and Latino workers, both because they are disproportionately represented in the public sector, but also because these are the workers who were hit hardest by the pandemic. They were more likely to lose their jobs, and or to be frontline workers, as you all know. And so we saw, I think, what we see in the pandemic is that we've laid bare the structural weaknesses and inequalities of the US economy. Most of these things were true prior to the pandemic, but they've become glaringly obvious and painful during the pandemic. The racial injustice and systemic inequity that is built into the US economy. And so when Congress fails to act, as they are doing right now, they know very well that this is having a disproportionate impact on low-income workers, on women workers, and on workers of color. And that is just extraordinary. And then on top of it, we see that workers are very likely to lose their employer-provided health insurance during the pandemic. I think we had around 12 million workers who lost their health insurance right in the middle of a public health crisis. So at each level, these are self-inflicted economic wounds. Policymakers know what the economics says. The economics says we need to take steps. The federal government needs to take steps to extend the unemployment insurance and to give the aid to state and local governments. And not only is that the right thing to do, the compassionate thing to do, because people are hurting, people are going to be losing their homes, kids are going hungry, people are not getting the health care that they need. These are very compelling moral arguments, but it is also true that if we care about the health of the economy, we need to take these two steps, because otherwise what we are doing is guaranteeing that this recession will be what sometimes call a double dip, that after the first downfall, we started to have some slow recovery, not fast enough, and the failure of the federal government to act, of Congress to act, and to take the steps they need to take, which they should have done a couple months ago, is actually going to cause the economy to fall a second time, just as the virus is getting worse. And we know that as we get into next year, we'll get into 2021, thank gosh, we'll have a new president and vice president in the White House who will be focused on this, but we don't know what kind of Congress they're going to have exactly. We don't know what the balance in the Senate will be. And so it's going to take a lot of pressure from folks like you, from labor, from community activists, to be constantly engaging with our members of Congress to make sure that they don't blink, that they put in place, and I have more hope for the new Congress than I do for the current Congress, because we've seen how these folks are acting. But in the new Congress, that they can both do a substantial, and my colleague Josh Bivens at EPI has said, we need basically $3 trillion worth of stimulus between now and 2024. We need $2 trillion between now and 2022 of just immediate aid to goose the economy, to get it going again, to provide the demand that the private sector isn't able to provide right now, and then another $1 trillion through 2024. And we should finance that with debt. It's not a big deal. Inflation is low, interest rates are low. We can and we should take the steps we need in the economic emergency that we're facing right now, and then we can grow out of that debt in the future. And we think at EPI that we should be aiming not to get back to the 3.5% unemployment that the US economy was at prior to the pandemic, but we should be going for 3%. Because even at 3.5%, we did see, as Ann-Maret said, and I think that's a really important point, when the economy is running hot, when unemployment is low, workers have more bargaining power. That is just a fact of life, but it takes a longer time. We did not see signs of inflation at 3.5% unemployment. And that's why we think we can't afford, we should be aiming at 3% unemployment. That's an economy where workers begin to rebuild their power. And hopefully we'll have a new Congress and a new president. We can take other steps to build worker power, like strengthening the voice of workers for collective bargaining, raising the minimum wage, making sure we're protecting workplace health and safety at the Labor Department. Those are all important things. And so if I'm summarizing the arguments that we've been making at EPI, one is $3 trillion, run the labor market hot. And the third piece is don't flinch too soon. Go big and stay big. Because one of the mistakes that was made in the last recession, remember the 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, is that in 2010, the economy was not recovered. And yet there were a lot of folks, the austerity crowd, I think that Colin mentioned before, even within the Democratic Party, who started saying, oh, you know, we've got to start pivoting to deficit reduction in 2010. And yet unemployment was still low, still high in 2010. And what that decision to, sometimes people talk about pulling away the punch bowl too soon, of slowing down the economy and starting to raise taxes and cut spending too soon, cost millions and millions of jobs over the next 4 or 5 years. Because if you might recall, it took us almost 10 years to recover from the Great Recession. And we don't want to see that happen again. There's economic consequences to doing that. There's also political consequences. You know, this election was probably closer than it ought to have been. But what we don't want to see is Joe Biden, Kamala Harris getting to 2022. If they've been too timid, if the Congress blocks the kind of economic recovery that we need, then, you know, the economy's still going to be in pain. The labor market's still going to be suffering in 2022. And we know what happens in the midterm if we have high unemployment and slow growth and a lot of economic pain, which is that, you know, that becomes an excuse again for people to vote against the incumbent party, and that shouldn't happen. So the different elements that we need to extend the unemployment insurance. We should keep the $600 additional payment and the broader definition and the longer term. The economy still stinks. People are still out of work. People can't work because the economy is not open yet. And so through no fault of their own, this is not a problem that we've sometimes seen in the past where people argue like, oh, if you have high unemployment insurance payments, then people aren't incentivized to get a job. People can't work if it's not safe to do so. So we need the state and local aid at about $500 billion a year through 2022. We need supplemental nutritional assistance, food stamps, around $100 billion. And we need to have the investments in early childcare education. And then eventually, as the economy starts to recover, all the investments in infrastructure and clean energy and the care economy that can create millions and millions of jobs. Those are sort of the medium to long-term investments that the government should be making to make sure that we can recover smoothly and that we can create jobs in all the sectors that will, some of the sectors will not come back from this pandemic. I think we're going to see a permanent realignment around things like travel, business travel, hospitality, and so on that will leave some scars on the economy. And that's why it's important that the government play a pretty central role in creating millions of jobs in the interim so that we can get back to a decent economy. So why don't I pause there and look forward to your questions and discussion. But thank you so much for having me, and it's really a pleasure to have a chance to chat with all of you this evening.
Great. Thea, I'm actually going to start off with one question to get us rolling here. And it's to give a little bit of context that I think some folks on the call will definitely know, but some folks won't. There's a local UAW factory here in Rochester that has for years made fuel injector systems, but also did the sort of research development prototyping of General Motors hydrogen fuel cell technology. And so, there's a lot of interest in moving towards these sort of green new economies, right? And a lot of interest in seeing that stuff go, but without sort of really clear federal funding to finance sort of made in America green economy infrastructure. The demand unto itself in the private sector isn't moving quickly enough for the climate crisis, let alone sort of the economic crisis. And so I've got a question here just asking sort of what's it going to take, do you think? And I'll add to it about in this particular moment, where do you think it sort of falls as a tool for recovery to get the federal government to really invest in that sort of green sort of infrastructure and manufacturing that happens in the United States in a way that supports the American economy and manufacturing industry?
Thank you, Colin. That's a really good question. And it's something that's close to my heart because I've spent a lot of my time working on manufacturing and trade policy and procurement policy. And I think this is actually an opportunity because we can all sort of recognize what's happening with the increasingly volatile weather events and flooding and hurricanes and so on, and the encroaching ocean. And an economic crisis is actually, and you talked, I think, earlier about the right wing always taking advantage of crises to push their agenda further. Why can't we turn the table and do the same thing? So we have a crisis. We've lost tens of millions of jobs. A lot of people are displaced. They're out of work. They're facing things. And yet at the same time, we have this burning need, which is that as a country, we need to take some pretty dramatic steps towards reducing emissions, towards more renewable energy. And in the past, I feel like too often we have made a conflict between labor and environment. Like, the environmentalists want one thing and good jobs. We need to protect the status quo. And what I'd like to see, and I think the Biden administration is interested in doing this, is to make sure that we take some pretty dramatic steps with big investments that are needed in transition to more renewable energy, more climate-friendly jobs, and that we make sure that we are making those good unionized jobs, that we're doing everything in our power to reward companies that hire union workers, that respect labor laws and that do that. And then also that we are procuring as much of the inputs that go into it in the United States of America. And that's definitely something that the Biden administration or the Biden campaign has talked a lot about. This is absolutely doable. But it's going to take some partnerships and a lot of spending, but a lot of spending is what the economy needs right now. It needs trillions of dollars worth of spending. And so in some ways that is convenient. The US also has underinvested in infrastructure for a couple of decades now because of there's been a lot of dopey deficit, sort of fake deficit concerns that have caused both Republicans and Democrats not to invest heavily in infrastructure. And that means that a lot of things are crumbling, our bridges, our highways, our public transit systems. But even as we, let's say we were to retrofit government buildings, including schools and hospitals and government buildings, to make them more energy efficient, that's actually something that's an investment in the future, because that's going to reduce the spending on fuel, for decades to come. So it's a good investment. It's not consumption. It's investment in lower costs in the future, and yet it also creates potentially lots and lots of jobs, and they can be good jobs. So that's up to us, and those are the kinds of decisions that the administration and Congress are going to be making in the coming months. And they need a lot of pressure from folks out in the world to keep the pressure on.
I have a question or a comment. Colin, does anyone else have a question or comment? And then I can wait.
No, you go right ahead, Amaret.
Okay. I just thought this was an amazing point that you brought up, because in November, the 3.5% unemployment rate was such a shakeup for the employment industry. They were flying people in for interviews here in Rochester, and where can we find this IT person? And we can't find them, and we're going to have to raise wages, and we're going to have to, increase benefits. And the suggestions that I would have to these employers is, yeah, pay them more benefits, give them this, give them that, make it just a better. But think about now, just because the unemployment rate is high, I almost feel like we're in the same issue with employers who are still trying to source but can't, because there's still no one to be found. You know what I mean? And even though that people are not working, there were never people to be found. And then in certain sectors, we're going to still see that power like you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, in human services, they're starving for people right now. Because here in Rochester, people are homeschooling their children, and they can't leave their house to go to work. So they're not looking for work. So it's almost as if they're working themselves for the employer, So there's still power in certain sectors. It's really weird, because it's not this traditional unemployment that we know of it as to be.
Yeah, I think the current moment is really peculiar, because some people just aren't safe going to work. They have health concerns, they have childcare concerns, and that's, one of the reasons that women have been harder hit than men. But I think that, this question about like employers are desperate for workers, we hear that sometimes, and yet we don't always see wages rising as much as we should. Normally, as an economist, that's what we say. Like if you have a shortage of labor, try raising wages pretty dramatically and then see what happens. And, you're going to draw people into the labor force if you do that. And you actually, so that's one of the dynamics that we do want to see. Wages have been stagnant for a couple of decades in this country, where even as the economy has grown, most of the economic growth and the economic benefits have gone to the top 1% or the top 0.1%. And so a low unemployment economy is one where people can actually bargain for big wage increases. And I know that we've had a lot of cutbacks in federal spending and jobs also at the local and state level, which has been really, really damaging.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually going to open up a line from Ashley, who is a member of the Rochester Teachers Association, and give her a chance to ask her question. Ashley, you should be good to go.
Thank you. Hi, Thea.
Yeah.
We in our union, and actually like other teachers unions statewide, have been fighting for folks to support Senator Jackson's bill to fully fund our schools and get the foundation aid that we're owed. And depending on what you read, we're owed somewhere between like 80 or 90 million at this point. And 70% of our funding comes from that state aid. So sort of futile to be fighting at the state level at this point. Because you were saying, you know, the state and local governments need that aid from the federal government. So should we be fighting sort of both fronts? Because this bill would, you know, is proposing to like tax the rich and get our foundation aid from the state. But what are some ways we could like put pressure on the federal government to get this money? And then does it still make sense to also, you know, go after that that bill from Senator Jackson as well?
Thanks, Ashley, for asking the question. I think you need to do both. It's definitely a both and because, you know, if you can, certainly a bill that raises money from taxing the rich in order to fund teachers, that's a great thing. And that, you know, we're going to actually need a ton of revenues from every source. And so if states have the ability to raise revenues, they should absolutely do it. And at the same time, I want to see, you know, pressure on the federal government, on federal lawmakers, both Congress and Senate, the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, to give the kind of substantial aid to state and local governments they should. But, you know, even now, like as they're debating the bill, I've said we need at least $500 billion in state and local aid. The $900 billion compromise bill that's being talked about only has $160 billion of state and local aid. So, you know, they're not really stepping up to do the right thing. So I think absolutely keep the pressure on at the state level and the federal level. That's the right thing to do. But thanks for the question and good luck with it. My daughter is also a teacher, and it's just crazy to see that, you know, teachers are under so much pressure and yet the funds aren't there to make sure that they have the adequate staffing they need to be able to teach safely and so on at this moment.
So it looks like we have another question here from Candace Rubin, also with the Rochester Teachers Association. Because I don't have heads up for her to go straight to camera or anything, I'm just going to allow her to talk right now and see how that goes. Well, maybe not. Candace, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, it looks like the key to all of this is in putting political pressure on, and yet many of our members aren't either politically motivated or they don't understand the centrality of politics to this whole process. So how would you promote education with union members so that they can, you know, become more of a political fighting force?
Thank you, Candace. That's a great question. And it's something, when I was at the AFL-CIO, we were always trying to figure out how we could do more education and, you know, common sense economics, that we would do little modules about educating union members. Because I think that's for me, one of the important roles that a union can do is to engage, mobilize, energize, educate members to understand what these big policy debates are about and to get them interested that, you know, this is something people are a little bit disconnected, and yet this is our livelihood, this is our economy, this is our jobs going forward. And we know what the right thing is to do, and the politicians, for whatever selfish or short-sighted reasons, are dragging their feet. We see this actually a lot, and this is something I don't know if it's a failure of us economists that we haven't been able to articulate or to convince people or to educate people well enough, but something like, you know, the value of unions or the minimum wage, that, you know, raising the minimum wage tends to be very popular. And even in Florida in the last election in 2020, I think it was like 70% of Floridians voted to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour in the state of Florida. And yet at the same time, they voted for Donald Trump to be president. And if, you know, he had his way, he would veto a national minimum wage bill. So how is it possible that lawmakers don't pay a price when they take these unpopular votes? And right now, to me, you know, Mitch McConnell and the Senate that are obstructing aid at a time when people are dying, literally, and, you know, and the need is so great, and the economists, even Republican economists, even conservative economists agree that this is needed, and yet they still won't do it. To me, that's a failure of our democracy, but also a failure of education. So I would love to see unions, and I'm not sure what, maybe you tell me what would be the most effective way of engaging people and educating them about this.
Well, a few years ago, we had a CWA boot camp for 3 days and members were paid. And I saw a big transformation at the end. And they were all ready to, they went out and canvassed for our county ledge candidates, and they were energized, and they heard a very comprehensive presentation of what's going on economically. So I don't know how to, how to replicate that. but
That's really good to hear. That's really interesting.
It's very memorable.
Great. We've got another question here from Claire, and I'm going to open up to you in just a second, Claire. There you are, Claire. You should be good.
Hi, I'm also from the RTA and teacher. So I was listening to the description of the furloughs in Syracuse, and while at first I was like, oh, that sounds like a good idea to build solidarity, it actually then seemed like, oh, that might not work though, because if you're a low wage worker, you can't really afford to lose a day's pay, even if you get to keep your job in the end. So I'm wondering, what are some options for organized labor? What can we do to push back on like what seems to be a concession to me, right? Like you're taking days off and losing pay in order to protect those lower wage workers from like kind of taking the brunt of this downturn.
I'd like to answer in and maybe hear what you have to say then also, Thea, that if we hadn't took the furlough, the 4-day furlough, now it's 1 day every couple of months, they would have been laid off. So it's not because, we wanted to just do this in solidarity as a movement. It's that we wanted to save their jobs, because right now they wouldn't have any healthcare or jobs. It was a layoff that they were facing. And so it was a desperate situation, and it was a saving grace, because then they could still, get through this with healthcare and things like that. So it was not something that, we love. And I think in not COVID times, we wouldn't want to do anything of the sort. But I think unions are facing hard decisions. And I know that even other unions are looking at that furlough option as something that could save jobs. Because just because we want to save one set of worker, we can't let the other set suffer. So it was a good way to just, keep people working. But I'd like to hear what Thea might say.
Well, I'm gonna leave it to those of you who had to like hash out these tough political compromises. It's never easy, certainly not in a time like this. But this it's one of the things. In an ideal world, the federal government would step in and do something like a paycheck guarantee program where people would be paid to stay home while it's not safe to go to work, and that's something that some of the European countries had done, and it was effective. And I know in Germany, they sometimes have done basically, work sharing, which is a little bit like that. Like everybody goes to part-time work and would be able to stretch out the resources over a longer period of time, and it preserves people's jobs. And I think that is something which is really useful. If you can preserve the employment relationship, then it becomes easier. I mean, I don't think we knew this was going to go on for 9 months, 10 months, 13 months, however long it's going to go on for. It does become more stressful for everybody when it goes on that long. But, what you want, if you preserve the employment relationship, which a furlough or work sharing agreements can help with, then it's easier to bring people back when the vaccine is there, when it's safe to come back, when the economy bounces back, and also it can preserve people's health care, which can be useful too. But all of these, I wouldn't presume to weigh in on a debate that I wasn't part of. So just, giving general answers.
Thea, one thing you sort of mentioned briefly, and I think that this is something that I run into with a lot of members, and frankly, just a lot of political conversations beyond that, both with Democrats and Republicans, is sort of this mythology of public debt, as the notion that we can go into debt, and that's actually not nearly as detrimental a thing as maybe your own personal debt. Do you have some sort of like couple of bullet points you can give that like help us get past that mythology with folks?
Thank you, Colin. That's a really good question. And it's something where it's not true that the federal government is just like a family and has to budget it has to balance its budget just like a family does. It is the federal government. It can print money. And one of the things that we've seen over time is that it's not that the federal government doesn't have to worry about how to pay for things, because they do, but they can make a distinction. And I'm going to talk about 3 different categories of spending. One is emergency stimulus spending in the middle of a deep recession. That is nobody's fault. That is something that's there. That kind of money needs to be spent as a deficit, because that's actually how you stimulate the economy, is by spending money you don't have in the short run in order to get the economy, basically generate the motor so that the economy can start running on its own, and then eventually have the capacity to pay back that debt. The other 2 categories are consumption and investment. And I think I talked about it a little bit when we talked about the Green New Deal or the climate change kind of jobs or infrastructure jobs or even care economy jobs. If you're investing in the future, you're investing in the productive capacity of the economy. You are building capacity, you are building wealth for the economy. When you take steps like, let's say, build a railroad or a bridge or a public transit system, or even train workers to be more productive, or give, early childhood education and care is actually a good investment in the future, because we all know that kids who are hungry and don't get the kind of care that they need when they're young will not be as productive as adults. And so like all those things are good investments in the future. And that's why the government can and should invest that way. Now, and then consumption is the last category. And that's mostly what happens when you give tax cuts, especially tax cuts for the wealthy, like the 2017 TCJA, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that the Republicans ran through. That was giving money to rich people to spend on whatever. And that was like the least effective way for the government to spend money. So if we can make the distinctions between being in an emergency fiscal crisis where the economy has tanked, that's a good time to deficit spend. When we invest in the future, like with renewable resources or infrastructure or the care economy, that is a good investment for the future, because we are building capacity and the economy will grow faster in the future, and we will be able to pay our debt down. When the government wastes money on current consumption, and you could also put military spending, some kinds of military spending in this category, and tax cuts for people who don't need it, then it's not such a great way to run up the deficit. So those are the different categories. But what we've seen is that a lot of this deficit scare talk that you hear, like, oh gosh, it's so irresponsible, we're going to be burdening our children with debt and so on, turns out not to be true, that we can do a fair amount of deficit spending. And if the economy is growing faster, we actually never do have to stop and pay down the debt. We can print more money so long as the economy is healthy and is growing.
It looks like we have a conversation, a question for Amaret, and I'm actually just going to take one more sort of call for like a last round of questions for folks while Amaret is asking hers. So if you've got a question, now's the time to put it out there. Otherwise, we will begin wrapping up after that. Amaret, go ahead.
Yeah. While you're here, so I'm one of those affected by student loan debt. And so we're hearing, oh, if you forgive all the student loan debt and whatever, might be said about that. But what are the benefits to, say, a $50,000, for each person, or even $10,000 of the student debt relief? What will that do for the economy? What are the benefits to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess you can think about it in your own situation. Like if you were freed up from that student debt, what might you do differently? You might spend more money, which would be good for the economy. You might buy a house, which you couldn't do, or uh, have a kid, or all the things that student debt might be keeping you back from. And this is one of the things, this is maybe a point that isn't that well understood too, which is that doing student debt relief is definitely going to help lower income folks, not the lowest income. Maybe it's low and middle income folks, people who were lucky enough to go to college and to run up that debt. But that debt, you know, college is just too expensive in the United States of America, and it's a burden that young people have and that they carry with them for years and years and years, and it prevents them from being able to sometimes switch jobs, to buy a house or spend money and so on. So whereas if you gave $50,000 to Jeff Bezos or, you know, another billionaire, they aren't that likely to spend it because there's only so much money you can spend. There's only so many, you know, gold-plated faucets on your private plane that you can have, or your yacht. And so that's one of the reasons when we talk about the amount of stimulus in the economy, that giving money to people who need it, and giving money to working people, and giving money to people who aren't already wealthy is actually better for the economy than giving it to the super rich, because the super rich tend to stick it in their Swiss bank account or under their mattress or whatever it is people do with their money, but they don't necessarily go out and spend it. And so it doesn't generate as much economic impact as something like relieving student loan debt would, because we know that folks really need that money and can use it in a lot of ways that are good for the economy.
Thank you.
So first off, Thea, I'd like to thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us. You know, we were talking just a little bit before this began, and I feel like so much of the labor movement and so many other political movements right now are really starting to open up the realm of really being able to have like a great dialogue on a local level with a national leader such as yourself at this sort of a level, because it's just so much more logistically easy now that folks are getting sort of more used to Zoom. So I'm hoping, you know, while I'm really looking forward to not spending so much time on Zoom, I do hope that in the future, this is something that we get more accustomed to, so that we can continue to welcome folks like yourself to join us for localized conversations on some of these things.
Well, Colin, it was my pleasure to see you again after we came into contact back in the olden days when you were with the United Students Against Sweatshops. And Amoret, it's a pleasure to get to meet you across Zoom, and Candace and Claire and the others. It's really nice to be able to have a little bit of a conversation, a little bit of a chat in these strange and isolating times. So great to see all of you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And before folks take off, I just want to make sure to let everyone know that there is at this point just a bit of news. There's a forming labor community coalition around budget cuts at the state level coming together. If you are interested, I'm going to put my email in the chat right now. If it's something that your union, or if you're part of any community organizations that would like to connect to this effort, there's going to be an effort around a handful of bills to get the New York State government to raise taxes on multimillionaires and millionaires and billionaires, and use that funding to help fund the sort of essential public services that the state is supposed to be funding properly. And you know, we're trying to make a point of doing this in a labor and community way, because for every critical job lost, there's also critical service lost on the other side of that. So I'll just leave my email up there for a second, and folks can take it. Otherwise, you can reach out to the Rochester Labor Council at any point, and you'll find my information for that. So hopefully we can enter the new year really swinging on some of these issues. So thanks everyone so much for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you all out there as we start fighting for these things. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay.